Scott Noel's recent show at Philadelphia's Gross McCleaf Gallery reveals a master of realist painting whose prodigious technique serves a poetic sensibility. Scott discussed his relationship to two current camps in realist art: the Atelier movement, which reveres 19th century training, and the pragmatist school, which embraces photography as an aid to painting.
I think I've tried to set a course as a painter between the pragmatists that will use any kind of means to achieve an image and the dogmatists who insist on a kind of 19th century academic purity in their work. That said, I have great respect for artists associated with both domains. I paint compulsively from observation. Everything I do, every problem I take on, involves creating opportunities to be in the presence of what I'm painting. Why that's important to me, I used to think it was because there was some virtue about the truth of one's experience. Now I tend to think it's simply a way of setting the imagination free. I'm really interested in perceptual painting that deals with a way of seeing that can be confirmed in another viewer's experience, but also seeks to kind of open up a space which for me is poetic and eccentric. I referred to that space as the space of desire.
There are often nudes in Scott's work. I asked him about the eroticism that I, for one, see in his work.
I was once asked by a woman whose husband wanted to work with the life model because I think she feared for her marriage what this would mean. When you paint from the figure, there always is an erotic charge to it, but it becomes so highly sublimated by the nature of the painting problem. Artists have always been drawn to painting appearances as an expression of a kind of libido, not just about the model, but about the world. There is a way in which the world is so sensually charged that that becomes part of the subject matter of painting. I think of that libidinal energy being transformed into a kind of prayer that puts you in contact with other things. The history of the activity, the distinct and inimitable quality of a person who sits for you, the life of paint, the life of color, the rightness of the way a figure stands on the floor, the rightness of a light, the power and sensual bloom of the color of masonry against the sky.
His monumental landscapes evolve slowly over months.
Many of the cityscape pictures in this exhibition were done in a public elevator lobby at the Hamilton building at the Academy, where I've got people coming and going all through the day when I'm working.
They are still images representing hundreds of composited slices of time.
The builders would probably be able to tell you that what exists in the painting was never there at any one time. From left to right, things have been added, painted out, and the construction has been followed from pouring of the second floor deck to building the frame for the second floor deck. Almost all the little workmen, those are painted wet into wet. When they appeared, it's a giant alla prima painting in a strange way. Life painting is forcing you to make radically committed decisions because in all likelihood, you won't get the right conditions a second time, so you better make it count.
The bright sunlight on the model in his painting Deny only lasted for 15 minutes a day.
To paint that figure and get a convincing relationship of the sunlight to her shadowy flesh required me to paint on her body for 4 hours, keying all the tones on her face and torso and shadow, so that very, very briskly, When the sun came in the room, I could seize that relationship.
Scott is a firm believer in painting the forest instead of the trees.
One of the things I tend to teach about is the possibility of achieving a convincing illusion or a recognizable image through very simple means, through a direct and simple address to large relationships that make up a visual field, and then can be broken down or elaborated into the smaller forms that people associate with lightness. The way a body becomes recognizable first as a kind of silhouette, as something highly simplified, and then reveals or releases certain kinds of particularizing details. I mix up very large amounts of paint. And those tones are moved with a knife and a house painter's brush into position. And when that paint is wet, I will use smaller brushes or a knife to begin pulling details out of those large chunks of paint. I found long ago that if I was scrubbing paint on with a number 2 bristle brush, I was never going to get the painting moving in a big enough way to get the large color feeling that I was looking for. The blonde or light tones are put on with a lot of impasto, and then details are cut very directly into that impasto. The more correct the large masses are, the more suggestive the detail.
His paintings often carry mythic overtones.
From the beginning of my working life, I've loved history and Greco-Roman and biblical stories. They keep coming up for me as armatures to make pictures. For some artists, the painting begins with a story, and for me, that's never the case. My narratives always begin with spaces and people. I become visually stimulated by a place, inspired by a person who's modeling for me. As I paint them, they become full of associations. I find myself like a kid with his baseball cards. I mean, every time I paint, I'm going through an index file of painters from Titian to William Orpin to Edwin Dickinson, and their visual utterances are in my mind. And so when I find a space that interests me, there's a good chance that that space has some connection to a history of images. The stories that I attach to them suggest how elastic mythic stories are. Expanding the convention center was never simply an ode to the men building the construction site. It was like a giant sandbox that took me back to playing with toy dump trucks and cement mixers when I was a little boy. I don't ever think of myself as being particularly loyal to an archaeology of mythic plots. Telemachus and the Sirens, I'm alluding to the story of Odysseus and the Sirens, where a man is following the song of these beautiful women. Because my Odysseus is so youthful, I've ironically decided to call him Telemachus. And unlike Odysseus, Telemachus has let himself directly into the coils of the Sirens for who knows what fate. Painting from life grows certain qualities in you, which I think are a little bit like a musician's ability to improvise out of a theme that's given to them. And when my paintings feel good to me, I feel like I've achieved something grand out of very, very fleeting circumstances.